As you're making your to-do list, remember that you can also create a to-be list. Go ahead and think, how do I want to be in the meeting that I have to go to today? How do I want to be when I show up to dinner tonight? Don't stop at the to-do list. Get really serious and playful about your to-be list.
You are listening to Personal Development Mastery, the podcast that empowers you with the simple and consistent actions to take that will help you create a life of purpose and fulfillment. I'm your host, Agi Keramidas, and this is episode 420. Are you tired of feeling overwhelmed despite your professional success and yearning for a balanced, fulfilling life? By listening to today's conversation, you will discover how to embrace mindful planning and holistic goal setting. You will also learn practical strategies for balanced living and also how to incorporate playfulness and creativity into planning your schedule and your goals. Whether you are a high-achieving professional or a busy parent, my guests' actionable strategies today will inspire you to rethink your approach to time management. Before we dive in, if you enjoy listening and appreciate what we're doing, the quick favor I'm asking of you is to click the subscribe button. Now let's get started. Today it is my pleasure to speak with Danielle Mcgeough. Danielle, you are a certified elite life coach, professor, podcast host, and mom. You call yourself a planner addict and recovering overachiever. You are passionate about helping high-achieving working moms to be as ambitious about their personal lives as they are about their careers, enabling them to be bold at work while having fun and fulfillment at home. Danielle, I am delighted to speak with you today.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited for this conversation, and we will explore. I will try to capture it in something that I read when I was preparing for this. So the thing that I would like to explore with you today is taking a mindful approach to planning, as you say, and a holistic approach to goal setting. And I like very much these concepts. Before we go there, I would like to hear a little bit about your background, in particular what is relevant to this conversation. And I was reading that at 35 you had a major shift with something that you achieved but yet did not feel how you thought that you would feel. So I would like to hear more about that, what happened there and the transition and what led to afterwards.
Yeah. So, rewind about 8 years. And, I think about one particular night. It was probably 3 a.m. and I was wide awake. I don't know if you've ever found yourself up in the middle of the night, your brain's just churning, you're thinking about your to-do list, what you could have said, should have said the day before. And, that used to be me every single night. I'd be up, the anxiety would be churning. And at this particular time, like you said, it's probably around 35 and I just had my first kiddo, which I was really excited about. We tried to get pregnant for a long time and it finally happened. I was pregnant with my second kiddo and I just earned tenure. So I'm a professor at the University of Northern Iowa and I had my dream job in a lot of ways, so I had been working on this goal really my entire adult life. I was probably 20 when I decided I wanted to work in higher ed. And so, I did all the things. I got the master's degree, I got the PhD, I, went on the job market, got the jobs and earned tenure. And rather than feeling elated, I maybe felt relief, but I felt flat and overwhelmed at the same time. And so here I was sitting up in the middle of the night and I had pulled out a planner and some stickers. I was surrounded by stickers because a student had done a presentation in one of my courses about decorative planning as a way to help manage your anxiety. So, when she would sit down and plan her weeks and make her to-do lists and things like that, she'd feel really, really anxious. So her therapist had recommended to her, like, decorate it, put
Mhm.
stickers on it. And I was like,
Yeah.
stickers, I can get into that. And so, I was doing this, but I was also like, this is kind of dumb. It's 3 a.m. and I'm putting stickers on things. And it was one of those moments though where you kind of feel silly and you don't really know where it's going, but it ended up being a really profound moment for me that led me on this path of researching, time management and goal setting and personal development. And I've been studying identity in my professor work. So I study storytelling and identity and how people perform identity on a daily basis. And now I was really thinking through it from a different perspective of, like, what does a identity based approach to goal setting look like? And what is the role of, you know, mindful planning combined with this identity based goal setting? And how can that help us create the lives that we want to live
Mhm.
that are rich and fulfilling? And so, here I am, how many years later, and I now have two kiddos, um I've taken on different leadership roles at the university. I have a business and a podcast, and I'm probably doing more than I've ever done, and yet, like, I have loads of energy. I'm excited. I don't feel flat at all. I have direction, and I'm able to shut off work at the end of the night too and just be present with my family, and we have wild adventures. So, life's good.
It's great to hear. And from this different perspective that you have before and now, there was a phrase that I read that you used, and I would really like to expand on that because I think it will help us to, as lovely and wonderful it is to hear your part of the story, for someone who listens now that wants to implement, a similar shift without having to find themselves at 3 o'clock in the morning, or burned out, or before reaching that point. I think it is useful to find out how they can do something like that. So
Yeah.
the phrase that I really liked, you said that you were tired of trying harder and you were ready to try easier. And I
Yes.
think in this short phrase there is a lot of wisdom contained, and I would like to uh, hear what you think about this, mostly about the trying easier, because I think the trying harder, most of us, certainly the overachievers among us, they know very well what that involves. But please give me an overview of this concept.
I actually came up with this phrase of trying easier while talking with a friend. Actually, I think my friend Angela, came up with it, and we were like, oh, I'm just, like, so tired of trying harder and striving and striving. And I think that one thing that's a little bit counterintuitive is that when we put into practices that sometimes sound harder, right? Like, oh, taking time to reflect, taking time to plan my week, having clear goals, breaking those down. It sounds like more work. In fact, like, I didn't want to set goals. I was so resistant to it for a while because I was like, I don't want to add pressure to my already pressure filled life. But, like, what's counterintuitive about this is that when we take up and prioritize healthy practices, it actually makes everything easier. And so, a question that I really, really love to ask myself on a regular basis is, what would this look like if it were easy?
Mm-hmm.
And, if there is one thing that I could do that would make everything else easier, what would that thing be? And, sometimes those things are deceptively simple. I'm going to sleep, right? I'm going to fuel my body with things that support my focus and concentration. I'm going to take a little bit of time to relax and meditate and journal and connect with myself. And so what I think is really interesting is many of us resist those things because we don't feel like we have the time to or the energy to or whatever, because that feels, harder. But it's actually what allows us to try easier. And I think that taking also like a delightful approach to life, right? Like you can set delightful goals. You can set goals to put stickers in your planner, and how do you just have fun with some of this stuff, and all sorts of things start to unlock, and it really does feel easier.
If you enjoy this episode, can you think of one person that would find it useful and share it with them? I'd really appreciate it. It helps the show grow, and you will also be adding value to people you care about. Thank you. And now let's get back to the episode. Tell me then a bit more, because I want to hear something even more specific than that. In terms
Yeah.
of, let's say, planning. And
Yeah.
can you tell me something that you, maybe a practice or a way of planning, and what kind of term are we looking at when we plan like that? Are we looking at weekly, daily, annually,
Mm-hmm.
or all of them in different intervals? So if you can give me a little bit of the way that you, I know it is what you do, so but I'm interested to
Yeah.
hear your approach to planning. How do you plan, or how do you teach your clients to plan? That's probably more important.
Yeah. So I think that the very first stage for me, I call planning for clarity.
Hmm.
And the reason for that is, how do we set foundational practices around planning that also are personal development? So rather than thinking about scheduling, to-do list, calendaring as time management, I really think about planning as personal development. And the first step to that is setting up what I call a rise ritual. And what that incorporates is reflection, intentional planning, sensory activation, and embodying your new story. And so, one of the things that I think is so important is reflecting, because when we think about planning, it's very future oriented. It's like, what am I going to do? But I really think that you need to engage in some reflection that goes, like, what's working? What's not working? What would this look like if it were
Hmm.
easy? And that those reflections help you show up in the future the way that you want to. And then, of course, there are some just actual planning skills, which I really like to have daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and yearly practices. But, on a daily basis, one of the first things that I would recommend that people start with is just having a daily top 3. And the way that I think about this is pretty simple. It only takes about 5 minutes. Is, if there were 3 things at the end of the day that if you did, you would feel satisfied, you would feel content, you would feel good about things, what would those 3 things be? And what that allows you to do is practice prioritization, because I think that so many of us have been so inundated with choice that prioritization's a struggle. And when we're in cycles of busyness and
Hmm.
overwhelm and being scattered, we also we lose sight of what we like, And so, one, you do that, but then to recognize that that is data that you're collecting on yourself. So do that for about 2 weeks, and then look, are there trends and patterns in your daily top 3? And, if an alien came down and found your daily top 3, what would they say your priorities were?
Hmm.
And what are you doing? Like, for example, like what I'll find a lot of times with people is they'll be like, oh, my health, I'm going to work on exercise. So they put on their daily top 3 and then they never do it. Well, what's going on there? Like, what do you either need to change so that you are prioritizing your priorities, or maybe this isn't the season for this.
Yes.
And do you need to get real with yourself and honest with yourself that this actually isn't your priority right now?
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean that it can't be in the future. And that can be really hard sometimes, is to get honest with yourself about these things.
Indeed, and the question that you said to ask every day, what are my top three priorities? Just by asking this
Mhm.
question every day, that is a great opportunity for reflection, because you come up with answers, and then of course prioritizing them and doing them, and then reflecting also, I think, how, whether you've done them or not, and looking back at regular times. So thank you for that. There was another thing you said. You mentioned, if I got it correctly, you said the rise ritual. Is that how you said?
Mm-hmm. I did.
Which I like very much. Immediately when you say that, the more probably common phrase that we use for the same thing is morning routine. Yours sounds a little bit different. So tell me, first of all, how I like, because the word routine and the word ritual have a different energy to them. So I
Yes.
like the word ritual. So tell me a little bit more about that a bit.
So this is a little bit of so I have a graduate minor in anthropology, and I think you feel a little bit of that anthro nerd creeping out here a bit. So I really like to distinguish between routines and rituals and habits and practices. And the way that I sort of see it is that, one, when you have a habit, for example, it is supposed to be done over time so that it becomes unconscious. And that's awesome. We don't want to have to be super conscious about everything all of the time would be exhausting. And so habits are really, they're automized, they're automatic. But the difference between a habit and a practice then is that a practice is something that you do over and over again, but you want to remain mindful with it. And then a routine is basically habits stacked, and a ritual is practices stacked. And so, one of the biggest differences between a routine and a ritual is that a ritual asks you to remain present and mindful for it. And so I always joke that, I want my dishes to be a routine. I don't really want to be that mindful when I do the dishes. But when I'm doing my planning practices or thinking about my priorities or
Mhm.
scheduling my time, I want to stay present and mindful for that. And then the other thing is a ritual is transformative. A ritual transforms us from one state to another. So we might think about marriage as a ritual, right? We have these ceremonial rituals, and throughout different cultures, they transform us. You go into a marriage ceremony single, you end married, partnered, right? And so the idea is that a ritual should also shift you from one state to another.
Mhm.
And so that's part of what I help people do, is go, okay, where are you starting? What's the state that you're starting in? And how do you want to shift that state by the end? And that's also what really transforms our planning practices from time management and time management hacks to actual personal development and growth.
Mhm. You talked about the ritual as mindful, and I really like that. And for me, you said that there was an anthropology major, and for me, what is I find fascinating personally is the words that we use, the language, and how
Mm.
a change in one word with a very similar meaning can completely change how we perceive something. So I think if someone is struggling to do a morning routine, one thing they could try to do is look at it as a morning ritual instead, because even the change in the word will lead to a different perception of what it entails. But thank you for this answer. It was very useful, I believe. And There was something else that you mentioned very quickly, but I wanted to come back and ask you more. During the Rise ritual, you mentioned embodying your new story. Is that
Mhm.
affirmations? Is how is embodying your new story? How do you practice it or teach it?
Yeah, so I think that stories are so important. The stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, the stories that we tell others about ourselves, the stories about that we tell about others that are infused into our own sense of self. And so one of the things that I really help people do is once you've decided this is the transformation
Mhm.
that I want to enact, right? I want to move from this state to a next. How do we rewrite a story about who we are and how we show up? And, you know, we might think about this in terms of, Dr. Benjamin Hardy has some work called Be Your Future Self Now. How do you write a story or create a vision of who your future self is and get really, really clear about that? But then, for me, part of it is what does it look like to embody that?
Mhm.
It's not to just tell ourselves that story, but what does that look like in practice today? And so, really, part of this is how do we move it from an idea to an action? And we might even connect that with, James Clear's work on like atomic habits and his identity based approach to habits, where, it's not that you write, it's that you want to be a writer. And what are the practices and the habits and the routines and the rituals that a writer takes on? And so a lot of this is, getting really clear about our own stories
Mhm.
and then translating those stories into something that we tell to something that we do.
How do you go though from getting clear on them to embodying them? Because embodying
Mm.
is something different. It's way much more than being clear on it. So any tip on how to actually embody them once you're clear? Let's say you're clear with them.
Yeah, I think that that's where planning is so important because it's saying, okay, what is one thing I can do today
Hmm.
to enact my future self now? What is one thing that I can do in the way that I show up to work, in the way that I talk with my kids, in in my own commitment to actually doing my daily top 3, right? And so some of it is translating that story into what happens in your planner, what happens on your calendar, and what you actually are doing. And so I do think that that's where a lot of us get hung up, right? Is this shift from the stories that we tell to like what we're actually doing. And so, I think that there's a lot of different barriers that come between those things,
Hmm.
but a lot of it really is for me, how do we map that story now onto your daily calendar and the actions that you're doing and how you're spending your time? We vote with our time. How are you voting?
Let me ask you something else. What role we've been talking about, planning, maybe not so much about goal setting, but I suppose some of the principles are very similar. But in planning, what role does play, playfulness, creativity, fun, all those things, what role do they play, and how can one incorporate more of those into, the practice or the ritual?
Yeah. So I love that question. I was just in conversation with someone yesterday and we were talking about how, uh, if you're like, oh, I do strategic planning or I'm a goal setter, I'm, a high performer, people think that you're really, really rigid and that you are super, super serious. And we were talking about how like we're actually incredibly goofy people. And, it's funny because we both had, who I was chatting with, we both had backgrounds in theater and there's so much play in there.
Mhm.
And what's really interesting is that that play has to be um, that play is purposeful. You don't always necessarily give it a purpose when you do it, but the play is purposeful because eventually, in theater, you do have to have a show that goes up at a certain time and there's an audience that is like waiting on you. So, you got to be thoughtful and you have to deliver, but also you recognize that play does something. And so, when it comes to planning, one, I truly believe this sort of there's freedom and discipline idea that when we have a plan, it actually opens up space for play. But I also think that we can plan to play, right?
Mm.
And that there can be a playful element to it because for me, I'm more likely to do anything if I make it fun. So, put stickers in your planner, right? With a really flippin' nice pen, make it delightful. And so that's always a question that I like to ask people is like, all right, you got to clean your house. How are we going to make it delightful? Oh, I'm going to pump some jams. I'm going to dance around with my kids. We're going to turn this into a competition. Who can get this cleaned up the fastest? There are ways that actually making it fun, making it delightful, incorporating play into the things that feel like, that feel like the rigidity is so important. But I also think that when we have clear plans, it actually opens up space for spontaneity.
And all that reminds me of what you were saying earlier about being mindful of what is happening. Because when you're doing that, you are certainly it's a great way to be present in the moment of what is going on, rather than traveling mentally elsewhere. Uh, that's great, Daniel. Thank you very much. I have, before I start wrapping up this conversation, the first thing I want to ask you is, where will you direct a listener that has enjoyed listening to this today and wants to find out more?
Yeah, you can listen to me geek out a lot more about planning and goal setting on the podcast Plan Goal Plan. If you are interested as well, I have a free mini audio course called Bold and Balanced, and you can find that at boldbalancedwomen.com. And it will basically work you through a mindful, delightful way to delete, delegate, and automate so that you can free up some time so that you can then have time to do your planning practices and create that ritual.
Mhm.
And so go get it.
That's great. And I have two quick questions that I always ask my guests, Danielle. And the first one is, what does personal development mean to you?
Hmm. For me, I just really truly believe that as humans, we are here to live full, wonderful lives and that we are constantly evolving. So either you can be mindful about that personal development and how you evolve,
Mhm.
or you can just let it happen to you. But, it's going to happen. And so, I think that personal development to me really means taking a proactive approach to the way that we evolve throughout our lives.
Great answer. And a hypothetical question. If you could go back in time and meet your 18-year-old self, what's one piece of advice you would give her?
Oh, do it messy. I think I would just, let that perfectionism go and do it messy.
That's great. Danielle, I want to thank you very much for this conversation we had. I will. We said before we started recording, you mentioned the phrase jamming out. So I'm remembering it now, and I enjoyed jamming out with you in this conversation. I want to wish you all the very best with your both your personal and your professional life. And I will leave it to you for some actionable parting wisdom for the listener that has listened so far today.
Yeah, I would say that, as you're making your to-do lists, remember that you can also create a to-be list.
Mhm.
And so, you know, go ahead and think, how do I want to be in the meeting that I have to go to today? How do I want to be when I show up to dinner tonight and, things feel a little bit rushed before we cart the kids to the next activity? So, don't stop at the to-do list. Get really serious and playful about your to-be list.
And before I end today's episode, if you enjoy this podcast, can you think of one person that would find it useful and share it with them? I'd really appreciate it. It helps the show grow and you also add value to people you care about. Thank you. And until next time, stand out, don't fit in,